The Free Thinker Show. Ignite your mind, challenge the norm.
All right, ready for a deep dive into a case that still has people talking. It's one of those stories, the kind that reminds you just how quickly things can turn bad. We're looking into the disappearance of Jacob Wetterling.
Yeah, this isn't just about retracing the steps of a tragedy. We're talking about looking at how even the smallest things can become huge in an investigation, and how easy it is to miss information, sometimes for years.
Exactly. We're digging through police reports, witness testimonies, even confessions, trying to understand how this happened and what it tells us about how investigations work under pressure. So, let's set the scene, right? 1989, it's a Sunday evening in St. Joseph, Minnesota. Just picture this. 3 boys out for a typical Sunday night.
And that's what's so unsettling about this case. It all starts with something so normal, so relatable, it makes you realize this could happen anywhere, to anyone.
Right, it's that this could be my town feeling that gets under your skin. Okay, so 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling, his younger brother Trevor, he's 10, and their friend Aaron, who's 12. They decide to bike to the local store, Tom Thumb I think it was called, to rent a movie. They even grab a flashlight for the ride back, just in case.
It's that everyday detail, that little bit of caution that really gets to you knowing what's about to happen.
It really does.
Yeah.
So they're on their way home, riding down 91st Avenue, a route they've been on countless times before. Familiar scene, kids out enjoying their evening, totally unaware.
And then everything changes. Their ride home is shattered in an instant.
A man in a black mask ambushes them. He's armed, and he's got this commanding presence, orders the boys off their bikes and tells them to lie down, face down in a ditch. Then she starts asking their ages. Can you imagine the fear those boys must have felt?
It's a moment seared into their memories for sure, and those details they were able to remember become crucial for the investigation. They described the man, saying he was about 5'10", around 195 pounds, with a deep voice. He was wearing dark clothing, maybe camouflage, and kept saying these chilling threats like, "Shut up or I'll kill you."
Bone-chilling. And here's where it gets really disturbing. After comparing their ages, the abductor tells Trevor and Aaron to run, orders them to run as fast as they can and don't even think about looking back.
Yeah.
Terrified, they do exactly what he says, but as they run, they can't help but glance back. That's when they see it. Jacob, wearing his red hockey jacket with police department printed on the back, disappearing into the night with this masked man.
It's that image, that lasting image of Jacob vanishing, that stays with everyone. The boys, the families, the investigators.
Absolutely. They race home, fear just propelling them forward, and immediately call 911. The police get to the scene and find Jacob's bike and Aaron's scooter just abandoned by the road, but there's no sign of Jacob. What follows is a chaotic scramble as this huge investigation gets underway.
And it's in those first few hours and days that some really critical decisions are made, some helpful, and as we'll find out, some that really hurt the investigation's trajectory.
Like the neighbor who, drove across the crime scene, unknowingly contaminating potential evidence.
Yes, well-intentioned, of course, but it just highlights how even the smallest actions can have huge consequences in an investigation like this.
Then there's the car. Dan Ressier, he lived near the abduction site, and he reported seeing 2 suspicious vehicles by his driveway that day, one in the afternoon and another one around the time Jacob was taken. He even said the second car made this weird U-turn, almost circling back.
Yeah, this detail really caught the investigators' attention, and understandably so. That they brought Dan in for questioning, even put him under hypnosis to see if they could unlock any more memories.
And this is where things get interesting, right? Because under hypnosis, Dan vividly remembers seeing a dark-colored car and believes he saw someone who looked like Jacob in the passenger seat. But, and this is a big turning point, the police, after this extensive search, couldn't find any physical evidence of a car at the scene. They decided to dismiss Dan's account as unreliable.
And this, as we'll see, was a big mistake on their part. This dismissal sent them down a very specific path, a path that would cost them valuable time and resources.
A 15-year detour, to be exact, because it turns out that car, that was a crucial piece of the puzzle, overlooked in all the initial chaos of the investigation. It's hard to believe that, isn't it? That they had this piece of the puzzle right there in front of them, but it got lost in the shuffle.
Oh, yeah. And that's just it, isn't it? The sheer volume of information, the pressure to find answers quickly, it can lead to tunnel vision. Before we get too far down that road, we should talk about another cluster of unsettling events that were happening around the same time. This is where that whole "this could happen anywhere" thing gets even creepier.
You're talking about the Paynesville attacks. It's scary how close to home, literally, these incidents were.
You're right. Paynesville is just a stone's throw from St. Joseph, maybe like 28 miles, something like that. Anyway, in the years before Jacob disappeared, there were all these disturbingly similar assaults on young boys in Paynesville.
And these weren't just random, were they? There were very particular things about them that really set off alarm bells.
Exactly. Victims kept giving similar descriptions of the attacker. They'd say he was a heavy-set man, often in dark clothing, maybe camouflage. Some even mentioned a mask, military fatigues even. These attacks usually happened in the evening or at night, and he would often threaten the boys, saying things like, "Shut up or I'll kill you." Sound familiar?
It's like an echo of what Jacob's abductor said. The similarities, the descriptions, and then the fact that Paynesville is so close to St. Joseph. It can't just be coincidence.
That's what investigators thought too, and it shows how crucial it is to connect those dots, to look at events that might seem unrelated at first. And one case in particular really stood out from the Paynesville attacks, the abduction and assault of 12-year-old Jared Shirel in Cold Spring, Minnesota.
Gold Spring, which is even closer to both St. Joseph and Paynesville. It's like a triangle of fear almost.
Yeah, it's an unsettling thought. Jared's case happened only 10 months before Jacob was taken, and the similarities are eerie. The attacker approached Jared in a car asking for directions, then forced him into the vehicle. And just like with Jacob, Jared was told to run.
So let's talk about Jared's story. It's tough, but understanding those details, those parallels, it's so important.
I agree. Okay, so January 89, Jared's walking home from a cafe when a man in a car stops and asks for directions. And as Jared leans in to help, the guy grabs them and yanks him into the car.
It's a tactic that really plays on your empathy, you know? Makes it feel even more sinister.
For sure. Once he's in the car, Jared notices a few things. He thinks he sees a police scanner. You know those old school ones? Then the guy drives Jared to a secluded spot and assaults him.
And this is where the details, tough as they are to hear, are so crucial.
You got it. The attacker makes Jared take off his clothes and even keep some of them, like trophies or to throw off the DNA, which becomes even more important later on. But anyway, just like with Jacob, Jared is told to run, and he manages to get away and get help. Luckily, the police were able to get DNA evidence from Jared's clothing, but back then, DNA technology wasn't what it is today.
Okay, so they have DNA, they have these scary similar cases so close together, they even have a sketch from Jared. So what happens next?
Well, this is where, unfortunately, we see a major lead slip through the cracks, which just goes to show, even with what seems like good information, these investigations are complicated.
You're talking about Danny Heinrich, right? His name actually came up pretty early on in the investigation.
Yeah, it did. Remember those Paynesville attacks? Well, one of the suspects was a guy named Dwayne Hart. When they questioned him, he actually suggested they look at Danny Heinrich.
Heinrich lived in Paynesville during those attacks. He kind of matched the descriptions given by some of the victims, and he even failed a polygraph when they asked him about Jacob. Seemed like they had him.
Yeah, it did. But there were these inconsistencies. For one, Jared Shirel, even though he picked Heinrich out of a lineup as one of two possible suspects, he couldn't definitively say it was him. Plus, there was the issue of the car.
So even with the tip, the polygraph, the location, those small things were enough for them to dismiss Heinrich as a suspect. That's wild.
It is, and it just goes to show how easily crucial information can get overlooked, sometimes with tragic results.
Because now we know that dismissing Danny Heinrich was a huge mistake, one that would have a lasting impact on the case. You're right, dismissing him was a big mistake, a mistake with huge consequences. But if they were so sure about him at one point, how did they finally circle back to Heinrich after all these years?
Well, it was a bunch of things coming together. Advances in forensics, for one, and a new team of investigators who were really determined to get to the bottom of it.
What do you mean by a bunch of things coming together?
Well, DNA technology had come a long way since the initial investigation. So investigators were able to go back and re-examine old evidence. And on top of that, like I said, there was a new team on the case, a team that was really committed to leaving no stone unturned. And they kept coming back to Danny Heinrich.
Gotcha. So what was different this time? What made them take a harder look at him?
So in 2015, Heinrich was arrested, right? But not for Jacob's disappearance. He was arrested for possession of child pornography.
Wow. Okay, that changes things.
Yeah, it was a major turning point. When they searched his home, they found a huge amount of explicit material, some of it homemade. This really painted a much clearer and scarier picture of who they were dealing with.
Like all those red flags, his interest in young boys, him changing his appearance after Jacob went missing. It all made sense.
Right, exactly. And if that wasn't chilling enough, they found something else in his collection. Recordings of news reports about Jacob Wetterling's case.
He kept recordings. That's creepy, like he was fixated on it or something.
It's pretty disturbing, right? But that obsession, along with the child pornography charges, gave the investigators what they needed to finally get some answers.
So did Heinrich confess?
He did. He was facing a mountain of charges and overwhelming evidence. He ended up making a deal. He'd lead the authorities to Jacob's remains, but in exchange, he wanted immunity, both for the Wetterling case and the Shirel case. And, his confession was incredibly tough to hear. He admitted to taking Jacob, to assaulting him, and to ultimately murdering him that night.
It's just awful. What about the details of that night? What did he say happened after he took Jacob?
He said he drove Jacob to an abandoned gravel pit. It wasn't far from Paynesville. That's where he assaulted him. And then, while it was happening, a police car drove by and he panicked. He shot Jacob. Twice. In the head.
He panicked. Hard to imagine feeling anything but disgust for someone who could do something like that.
I know. And then he buried Jacob's body and tried to cover up what he did. He even moved the body to a different spot a year later. This time, it was a field near his house. The details are just awful. And what makes it worse is that Heinrich never really seemed that sorry for what he'd done.
It's just unimaginable. But at least Jacob's family finally got some closure.
Yeah, that's true. Because of the deal, Heinrich led investigators to where he'd buried Jacob. They found his remains and some of his clothing. DNA testing confirmed it was Jacob. At least his family could finally lay him to rest after all those years.
27 years, right? So where does the case stand now? Heinrich is in jail, right? But he's not in jail for Jacob's murder. It was for the child pornography, wasn't it?
You're right. He was sentenced to 20 years for the child pornography charges. And Jared Shirel, the boy who was abducted in Cold Spring, he filed a civil suit against Heinrich. He was awarded millions of dollars in damages. But there's still this question. Could Heinrich get out one day?
What do you mean? He could actually be released after everything he's done?
It's terrifying to think about, but it's possible. See, he was never actually tried for Jacob's murder because of that immunity deal. Some legal experts believe that once he's finished his current sentence, he could be released.
That's just unbelievable. To think that the man who did all of this could just walk free. It makes you think about the whole justice system, doesn't it? The balance between punishment and the possibility of rehabilitation, even in a case as awful as this one.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. The Jacob Wetterling case is so complicated. You have the missed opportunities, the mistakes made during the investigation, and the strength of the human spirit. It makes you confront some really disturbing things about the nature of evil and how difficult it is to find justice.
It reminds you that evil can be so ordinary, so close to home, and that we need to be vigilant, we need to question things, we need to pay attention to those details, and we can't ever give up hope, no matter how much time has passed.
You said it. And it's a reminder that these cases, they impact so many people. The trauma, the loss, it's felt for generations. It's a really somber reminder of the human cost of these tragedies.
It's a lot to think about. This deep dive, it's been fascinating and really disturbing. It's one of those stories that you just can't forget. It makes you question everything you thought you knew.
It shows how easily things can go wrong and how important it is to be aware, to question our assumptions, to really pay attention, and to remember that sometimes the truth is scarier than we can imagine.
This case, it's a reminder to never stop searching for the truth, to fight for the victims, and to make sure their stories are never forgotten. That's it for us this week. Join us again next time for another deep dive.